Also, very warm welcome from my side. I'm Raffaella Hillerbrand, and I'm professor here at KIT for Philosophy of Engineering, Science and Technology. And Christina had to do the practicalities, and as I am the head of the research group PhilETAS, so I have the pleasure to now really introduce today's speaker to you. Christina already welcomed you, Chris. We have Dr. Christopher Groves here today from the University of Cardiff. He is a senior researcher there, and he himself characterizes him as a sociologist and a social philosopher. And I think what that is can be best illustrated by Chris' own research and his research interests that sort of go in various directions. A strong focus is on the understanding of risk and uncertainty. Another one is the ethics and social impact of various technological changes, with a particular strong focus, of course, on the energy transition and a focus on decarbonization of energy technologies. And he's interested in the relationship between science and society. He has a strong interest in environmental issues, and I think that sort of gives the lens how he addresses also issues in the broad topic range of energy ethics, where he has numerous publications in journals like Science, Technology and Human Values, Futures, as well as Energy Research and Social Science. He will talk today about bringing care ethics and energy ethics together, a focus on vulnerability, attachment, and narrative. And if you're interested or get interest in these topics, energy ethics related to care, I only can warmly recommend his book on similar topics. It's called Care, Uncertainty and Intergenerational Ethics, and was published with Palgrave already in 2014, but I still can strongly recommend it. And I think it shows very nicely, as I think also the talk will do, how Chris manages to bridge normative research and empirical research in a rather unique way. I have another announcement of a book in the making to make with a colleague, Paul Anderson. He is currently writing another book on the theme of care and collective harm that will appear probably later this year or next year. And maybe as a side, it's nice to mention that Chris is also very active in public outreach. And as a fun note, he engaged recently with the Cosmopolitan journal in the UK, where they're running a feature in the March edition on the ubiquity of concern about the future in media and popular culture. So I very much look forward to reading that. But now I really look forward to hearing your talk on bringing care ethics and energy ethics together. So the floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Raffaele. I'm very interested to see what Cosmopolitan have me saying as well. But you know, with that lies in the future. And thanks to Christine also. So I'm just going to share screen and we'll get going. So the research I'm going to talk about today is from a project that I've been involved with for the past 6 years at Cardiff University called FLEXIS, Flexible Integrated Energy Systems, which brings together academics from Swansea, Cardiff and universities and the University of South Wales, together with local authorities, municipal authorities, Welsh governments, and various private sector actors, including Tata Steel. And this has been about exploring what a decarbonised energy system might look like in Wales, dealing with industrial decarbonisation and other issues. And the role of the social scientists from our group, the Understanding Risk group at Cardiff, has been to work with engineers to try and help anticipate social impacts of energy decarbonisation. And today I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing on care ethics and its potential relevance for energy ethics. As you may notice, one word in the title has changed. It's gone from vulnerability to responsibility. That really doesn't make too much difference. Without further ado, I'm clicking on my screen. There we go. It works. So often, energy ethics is dealt with, particularly with a view on the topic of just transition, questions about rights, the question of whether there's a right to energy. And around this topic, a variety of questions circle, particularly the question of what exactly a right to energy would be a right to. Certainly not energy in the abstract, a quantity of energy, rather a right to access particular kinds of energy services which support social participation. But once we're beyond this, as Gordon Walker's pointed out, and various other people too, it becomes urgent to try and work out, to specify what exactly end users, consumers might have rights to. For example, this can vary very much in terms of geographical and social context. Heating and cooling, for example, are specific needs in different areas of the globe. So questions of specification. There's also the issue about expansion, how a right to energy could potentially grow and grow. How we distinguish between needs, essential energy use, and wants or preferences is an issue. But a third problem is that even if you manage to establish a rights claim by itself, it's not clear who bears corresponding obligations, the obligation to fulfill that right. So if an individual has a right to a specific level of energy service, of heating, lighting, or whatever, who exactly is responsible for providing that? Now, none of this necessarily means that a rights-based approach is doomed to fail as a way of thinking about energy justice, but there are issues here that I believe using an approach based on care ethics can actually help us address. So a key, for those of you who are familiar with care ethics will know this, but just for the benefit of everybody, a key element of an ethics of care is its stress on how important relationality is to understanding human well-being and ethical life. And it's interesting that elsewhere in social science studies of energy, relationality has long been a theme at the forefront of research in social practice theory, for example, showing how individuals are enabled and constrained by social and material relationships that are part of the complex energy systems. And this idea I've taken it from Alex Shafran and his colleagues, the idea of the reliance system, the fact that we now, social and material infrastructures are an unavoidable part, complex systems of infrastructures are an unavoidable part of how needs are fulfilled in contemporary societies. Care ethics has emphasized that human agency and human autonomy, including moral autonomy, tend to be dependent on relationships, meaning that capacity to act is only possible under certain conditions, including particular material conditions, particular developmental conditions for in terms of human psychology and so forth. And in particular, this relates to the active care of others for an individual's needs. And care ethicists have often stressed how these systems of provision are very dependent on a highly gendered and racialized division of labor. So supporting autonomy, the systems that it rests on are often been overlooked as one key argument care ethicists often make. So in putting forward today some suggestions about the value of care as a way of thinking about the ethical and political significance of energy services and some of those problems that I mentioned previously, I'm going to look at the way care ethics can help with three issues there. So that includes, it can provide a richer understanding of why justice concerns about energy actually matter. It can give normative arguments for acting on such concerns, and it can help identify who should act and how to address them. So, again, I don't want to suggest that care ethics can necessarily supplant arguments about rights, but it can lead us to a richer understanding of the ethical issues with which rights engage. So, in the talk, I'm going to look at three central themes which are present. This is going back really to the work of Carol Gilligan, of a foundational figure in the development of care ethics back in the 70s and 80s, and relate them, distinguishing these from other ways of in which care ethics has been recently used to think about the moral and ethical significance of dependency and vulnerability. More recently, a lot of people working with care concepts I've drawn on ideas from Berenice Fisher and Joan Tronto about what we can understand care to mean. This idea, as I quote here, is that care is a species of activity that includes everything we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world. This has been influential, but it's also been heavily criticised as a way of understanding care by figures such as Virginia Held and Daniel Engster, who suggest that the broad nature of this definition dilutes what's important normatively and ethically about ideas of care. So while care ethics is often seen as concerned with particular relationships rather than universal principles, I'd agree with Held and Engster that you can draw from concepts of care normative, the ideas about where normative claims can be grounded that have to do with relationship and interdependence. And as we'll see, one way in which care is, I think, normatively important is that it can enable us to distinguish between forms of dependence that are necessary and contribute to well-being and forms of dependence which are actually harmful. So the three themes from Gilligan that I want to look at today are responsibility, the ways in which dependence and vulnerability can generate normative grounds for acting in particular ways. Secondly, narrative, the ways in which telling stories, if you like, particular kinds of stories about dependence can generate a form of ethical reasoning that maps dependence and vulnerability and how they change over time. And thirdly, attachment, the ways in which emotional meanings of relationships shape experiences of dependency and also influence how people respond to these experiences. And in talking about these three themes, I'm going to draw on two sources in addition to literature from care ethics. I'm going to be looking at some additional philosophical literature from normative ethics, but I'm also taking data from our team's qualitative research on the lived experience of energy vulnerability. That is, the lived experience of people whose circumstances tend to create a propensity for them to experience genuine energy poverty. And the role of qualitative research in helping understand these issues has been emphasized in recent years, given that it can address directly the lived experience of challenges people face in accessing energy services. And this use of qualitative work harmonizes with what Selma Zevenhuisen, in this quotation in front of you here, notes as a basic commitment of care ethics, a refusal to separate needs from the people who are their subjects, to take as a starting point the idea that people themselves have knowledge about their own subjectivity, about their own needs, and it takes seriously their stories about what they need to live well. Now, the research context for the qualitative data I'm going to talk about is in Wales. And as part of the FLEXIS project that I mentioned at the beginning, we've done some qualitative interviews, longitudinal interviews with residents of a small ex-mining village called Cairo, which, as you see here, is located in South Wales, in an area known as the South Wales Valleys. The valleys being an area which is materially deprived. The communities there are quite isolated in high-sided valleys, been subjected to long processes of deindustrialization. Cairo itself is a multiply deprived community. It was ranked back in 2019 as the most deprived community in Wales on health measures. So over 4 years and 5 rounds of interviews, we explored with the residents their experiences of the kinds of challenges they experienced in accessing energy services that they considered necessary to meet their needs. These interviews were mostly done before the recent high increases in energy prices globally, so you should bear that in mind when I'm talking about some of the aspects of the data. And I'm going to focus in this talk on interviews with one respondent with the pseudonym Terry, a man, a former skilled worker in his 60s, now workless due to prolonged multiple health issues. And I'm going to look at each of those three themes I mentioned in turn in relation to the two interviews that Terry gave. And although I'm presenting those things one after the other, it'll probably, hopefully be evident that they interweave and each reflecting elements from the others. And as I go, I'll draw on literature from care ethics and other sources to elaborate on what we might think, consider the ethical and normative significance of Terry's stories and the kind of experiences he's recounting. The first of the themes of responsibility. And I reproduce here three passages from several interviews that Terry gave, in which he represents his sense of how he and his partner, he lives with his partner, the children are grown up and moved away. He represents a sense in which he and his partner feel themselves to be thoroughly dependent on energy services. There's a level of basic need for energy which has to be paid for, which he describes as, if you look at the bottom of those, the third of those quotations, he describes it as a brick wall which you have to climb over before you can get to do anything else, because of the importance of heating, lighting, cooking, and so forth for supporting all everyday activities for social participation. And so this basic dependence creates a fundamental vulnerability to changing conditions, which might affect how available and accessible energy services are. And on many occasions across 5 interviews that were carried out, Terry points out that he and his partner, as he says here, in the second of those quotations, are effectively slaves of utility companies. That's how he feels, with no real choice but to pay whatever's asked of them, whatever the prices are like, whether the prices continually go up. In the UK, in a liberalised energy market, you can always switch between suppliers, but the prices across the market always increase, as we've seen most recently, of course, with the extreme increases in energy prices. They always go up and often by a very large amount. So consequently, Terry talks about not only being dependent on energy services, but also dependent on whoever's supplying them, who he feels are just not accountable in any way in an under-regulated energy market. The complexity of the system means that there's so many people, as he says in the first quotation there, involved in the supply of energy, that you don't know who you're talking to from one day or the next. There's a lack of accountability. It's difficult, if you do run into difficulties, to get actors to respond in a way that genuinely helps you, both because of the complexity of the system and because there are limited means in place to compel these actors to actually act to alleviate difficulties. Further, it's not just energy system actors, utility companies and so forth who are relevant here, because of the context in which energy services are consumed. Costs of energy is not the only challenge. The quality of housing, difficulties with keeping poorly insulated housing adequately heated in particular to prevent interior damp and cold, create additional vulnerabilities among people. These problems are particularly acute in the South Wales Valley, where much of the housing stock was built around 1900 or even before. So Terry and his partner own their home. Other interviewees rent from housing associations or private landlords, and they recount experiences of how they've been unable to get timely intervention from landlords to remedy insulation and other problems, resulting in very poor living conditions that create health problems. So housing's an issue, but pulling back even further, exposure to higher energy prices is not only a matter of housing, but also for many people in Cairo, it's a matter of a lack of employment opportunities and local employment opportunities, which means they have to seek work further afield, burdening them with costs of private car use or making them dependent on infrequent bus services because there's no local railway station. So together, these effects add up. We're talking about more than just energy poverty here. We're talking about conditions that exacerbate energy vulnerability. But it's with energy vulnerability that these issues are felt most keenly because, as Terry says, it's a brick wall, the cost of energy, which you have to get over to be able to do other things. Now, Terry's using here, talking of being a slave and so forth, normative language that identifies issues of dependency, vulnerability, and also issues of power. And care ethics can help understand what's at stake here. care theorists position interdependence as the basis of human well-being and of ethical life in general. Humans are understood as existentially vulnerable in ways that necessitate interdependence to support survival and to support flourishing. And human lives are generally characterized by, as Eva Kitte puts it, some kinds of inevitable dependency. But what the ethics of care adds to this general premise is that the recognition that dependence and interdependence are complex, often involve asymmetric relationships and very uneven, mediated by social structures and practices, such as, for example, differences between between the positions of doctors and patients in society. And these mediations change over time as people age, shift social status, or suffer disabling harm of one kind or another. So asymmetrical relationships of dependence between particular people or groups are often a necessary aspect of interdependence, but they involve inequality and power. So the asymmetries of these asymmetries can influence, can mediate vulnerabilities. They can create new vulnerabilities. They can make existing ones more serious. As Carol Gilligan wrote here in the quotation on screen, vulnerability gives rise to responsibility because of a recognition of connection, gives a kind of moral psychological impetus, at least, a perception of a need for response that animates how people take responsibility for others when relationships of dependence stand out from within complex contexts of interdependence. To go a bit further, we can look at the work of Robert Goodin, not a care theorist, but whose work closely meshes with, I think, with some of these ideas. In his book, Protecting the Vulnerable from 1986, he sets out a theory of normative ethics, which views obligations not as deriving from some voluntary relationship, as in a promise or a kind of the classic imagination of a social contract, but obligations which come from another being vulnerable to our actions or our omission of action. So Goodin discusses examples of this relationship of obligation, which range from parental relationships to professional responsibilities that come from the adoption of credential social roles on which others depend. So, for example, medical professionals and lawyers have, as he says, special and especially strong obligations to protect the interests of their clients. So Goodin's argument also has the advantage, it enables a focus on the specificities of relationships between ethical subjects and how they generate vulnerabilities. Vulnerability itself is not an abstract quality that somehow inheres in individuals. It's a product of social relationships. We may all be vulnerable, but the ways in which we're vulnerable, as I said earlier, are mediated by social relationships. So this account harmonizes with care theorists' arguments that responsibilities to others are distributed differentially around society on the basis of whether actors possess the concrete power to benefit or to harm others. So on his account, actors are therefore obligated to act in particular ways relative to others' vulnerability to their actions. Now, these themes are reflected in how the normative language Terry uses in interviews. He's kind of he points out repeatedly that irresponsibility is a kind of a moral failing of individual actors who are there in the energy system, who have different roles, but also a kind of characteristic of some of the relationships that characterize that system, the complex system through which energy services are provided. So this is irresponsibility in the sense of a lack of accountability, and also a sense of ways of acting that actively expose people to harm through a lack of adequate energy services. Some form of dependence on the energy system, he suggests, is inevitable, that idea of the brick wall you have to climb over. But at the same time, the way the system has evolved historically, together with the ways actors have come to perform their roles within it, it deepens the vulnerability of end users, particularly people in the kind of communities that Terry lives in. and helps to harm those who are made vulnerable to higher prices through low incomes, bad housing, and a need to travel to work. Dependency thus becomes bad dependency. So the sense here is that the kind of the profit, what he sees as the profiteering of energy companies, exposes people to harm, to detriment through a lack of adequate energy services, but also the ways in which landlords, local councils, and other actors, act within society, creates bad dependencies that expose people to genuine harm. Second theme I want to move on to now is that of narrative, and the ways in which narrative as a form of moral reasoning can be understood as working within these interviews. And again, going back to Carol Gilligan's work, narrative she identified as a dominant mode of moral reasoning for the women she was interviewing, a mode of moral reasoning which valued judgments about how you should act, not based on applying universal principles like the idea of rights or whatever to particular circumstances, but a way of determining what one should do that analyzes particular relationships and how dependence, vulnerability, and responsibility are distributed within them, and how these shift and change over time. And so the goal of reasoning in this way is to give a full account of how different and interrelated values, priorities, and needs are affected by how people act or avoid acting. And if, again, thinking about the way Terry describes what's morally salient for him about how energy services how his household, he and his partner relate to energy. He gives accounts of changes in his and his partner's circumstances that he relates both to specific energy issues, but also to biographical changes. But also he talks about wider social transitions that are social and technological in nature and how these are relevant. Across the interviews, he reports that his own circumstances change in a negative way. His health conditions deteriorate, resulting in increasingly restricted mobility and need to travel more frequently to medical appointments and so forth. And at the same time, prices of electricity and gas are increasing. He describes he and his partner using less electricity in particular as time goes on, as was said in mentioned in one of the quotations from a few slides ago, trying to do without as much as possible. At one point, he described keeping one light bulb on in the living room only, avoiding watching television. And he reflects on his own health problem and his own kind of situation of vulnerability in relation to those his father experienced. Here in the first quotation on this slide, he's talking about how his dad suffered lifelong ill health from working in the coal mines in Cairo. And though the causes of his father's ill health, he explains, are now gone, along with the coal mines, this was a result of a decades-long, economic patterns of economic development, but also a long socio-technical transition in the UK from the dependence on coal to dependence on other forms of energy, particularly the move from coal to natural gas for domestic heating in the 1960s and 70s. He returns then to the theme of how in Cairo, dependence on the mines for work has become dependence on other forms of employment outside the valley. Here he's talking about the second quotation there, about how people commute to different locations, even cities as far away as Cardiff and Swansea, which are a good hour away from where he lives. So he contrasts here the lives of his grown-up children with his own. He talks about them having long working days that involve significant commutes, the fact that they're too tired to take proper care of the energy they use. They don't save energy like he and his partner do, or his peers do. He and his partner learned early on to be frugal. They can cope with the challenges that come with these forms of dependency that characterize the present, he says, although coping involves using less and less energy, it seems. But just as he and his father, just as his father had to endure ill health, he and his partner now have to endure this continuing exposure to energy costs they can't fully control. So despite his situation being very different from his father's, the transition from coal to gas in the stories he tells represents this emergence of new forms of vulnerability that he has no great influence over. So he's weaving a kind of episodic personal story of increasing adversity with collective stories of transition between socioeconomic situations. And these broader transitions represent a kind of ambiguous transformation in the community he's lived in all his life. You've lost, with the closure of the mines, a major environmental hazard. You've lost a source of serious and fatal industrial illness, but you've also lost secure and relatively well-paid employment. And in return, you have conditions of increasing poverty, unemployment, dependence on relatively insecure employment further afield, and new forms of illness associated with greater poverty. So he talks about how he weaves into these stories another thread, the thread of energy insecurity, and which serves as a kind of counterpoint to them, echoing and reinforcing certain of the threads of these wider narratives. And together, these stories they identify particular forms of bad dependence, how they've emerged over time, both biographically and historically, collectively, and how exactly this badness, the badness of these forms of dependence is experienced. We draw here on a piece by Vosman and Niemeyer from 2017, which deals with patients, the experiences of patients, bad experiences of healthcare, if you like, experiences of bad dependence, which have two characteristics which relate to the kind of temporal features of people's lived experience. On the one hand, precariousness, on the other, suffering. Precariousness concerns that the quality of an experience where you can't be sure where exactly you're going to be in the future. You can't be sure whether help will be available if it's needed. And here in this quotation, again, you see Terry talking about struggling, not quite sure where you're going to be in a few weeks, at Christmas, and so forth, so that your ability to plan for the future is much restricted. So that sense of precariousness, precarity, it's not just a feeling, it's part of that feeling of precariousness that is related to inescapable features of your situation. Energy prices go up, but your income, particularly in Terry's situation as a retiree, remains the same. The housing stock your house continues to fail, needs repairing, and so forth. And also, no large businesses relocate to the valley. There's no employment for people. Whereas suffering, if contrasted with precariousness, testifies to how the kinds of harm that accompany bad dependence are not inflicted like a sudden blow. They're prolonged across collective history, across biographical time, and have to be endured as you have no power to act on them. As again, repeating that quotation from earlier there, you're a slave to the energy companies. I try to do without. He and his partner use less and less energy and have to bear that. Moving on to the third of the themes I mentioned, attachment. Attachment has a particular kind of significance in the ethics of care. Terry describes throughout the interviews how his experiences of energy vulnerability can be identified through paying attention to relationships. He talks about relationships with the municipal authority, with providers of transport, with urban planners, with landlords, with utility companies. So all these actors who have power to harm or to benefit, who have a responsibility to act in particular ways but don't. But throughout the interviews he gives, he registers how the kind of issues here, these dimensions of energy vulnerability that are morally salient, often in relation through his perceptions of how things are going for people that he cares about. So his partner, his friends, his children, his grandchildren, and he talks about the ways in which they too experience life through this, with this characteristic of precariousness. And as I said, attachment has this particular kind of ethical weight in the ethics of care. Another quotation here from Carol Gilligan pointing out, again, she wrote her book in a different voice on the basis of interviews she'd done comparing men's talk about morality with women's talk. So this gendered statement here in relation to attachment comes from there. But a sense here, and there is a sense in care ethics more broadly, that attachment, in particular moral attachment, is a kind of a morally important factor. It's not something that you should shy away from, that you need to be take an active disinterest towards to reach a certain degree of moral maturity. Rather, you have to recognize that attachment is itself a source of moral maturity and moral perceptiveness. And in social scientific studies of the meanings that can attach to energy consumption and consumption more broadly, attachment has been mobilized in some interesting ways, in a much broader sense, going away from just personal relationships with other people. Because in this kind of scholarship, and I'll show in a minute how it's relevant to Terry's narratives, attachment has been studied in relation to objects of various kinds, documented in studies like those gathered in Daniel Miller's Comfort of Things, for example, from 2009. The attachment objects in this literature are recorded as importance because of the way they have a constitutive significance for people's lives. That is, in terms of a concept of value, which goes way back to Aristotle and his conception of friendship, objects of attachment are experienced as a constitutive part of the individual, insofar as they and what happens to them can be very consequential for the individual's own well-being. And the idea here is that individuals and their attachments, individuals experience their attachments together, with their own well-being as linked, that they have a linked past and a linked future. And this is obviously the case when when you talk about attachment to other subjects, one's partner, one's children, or whoever. But objects as such can be objects of attachment in this sense. Cultural sociologists have argued objects which bear particular significance through a significant emotional investment. This can include cultural objects, attachment to groups, attachment to institutions, attachment to practices. And in relation to energy, scholars have explored the role of emotional investments to objects like solar panels, kettles, patio heaters, wood fires, and so forth, in shaping what people do and how they experience difficulties they have accessing energy. So in relation to Terry's interviews, some examples here of how attachment makes its presence felt. He recounts a narrative of what he considers important to understand the history of Cairo and its kind of ethical life. It's Sittlichkeit, if you want to use a Hegelian term. That shared hardship, if you go way back, talking about its early years in the 1890s, 1880s, he describes as a cowboy town, the Wild West. There was a shared sense of hardship, but also that gave rise to a particular kind of sense of social solidarity or mutual aid He talks elsewhere in his interviews about this maybe having reduced somewhat in more recent times, particularly given that many of those with jobs have to travel to work outside the area. But he still thinks that this backdrop to life in the village is still there. It's important to people there. This serves as a kind of key aspect of why he loves living where he lives. He talks about neither he and his partner, how neither his partner would ever consider leaving despite the poverty there and the difficult conditions. And this idea he has about the history of Cairo, the way he narrates the history, relates quite interestingly to a particular set of things he's done, efforts he's made to relieve the precariousness of his household situation. He talks about a wood burning stove that he installed. He was a skilled worker. He did this all himself. And he talks about how this wood burner has enabled him to kind of reduce fuel costs. It serves as a kind of buffer or bulwark against bad dependence, and it becomes in his narrative a kind of symbol of good dependence. It's not just a device; it symbolizes both the care he's able to take for himself and his partner and for his house, enabling him to alleviate the worst aspects of precariousness and suffering that come with the condition of bad dependence that he narrates elsewhere. And at the same time, it symbolizes wider forms of good dependence, the kind of mutual aid that he talks about being, the heart and soul of Cairo, if you like. He talks about how it, if you look at the quotation provided here, he has a friend who's a builder. He lets him have wood free to use in the wood burner. His sons, cut it up for him. Sometimes a neighbor might cut some trees down, and then his son will come with a wheelbarrow and wheel the logs to Terry's house. So there's a sense here in which there are positive forms of dependence here in Cairo that are symbolized by the relationships that connect to this wood burner, this device that is a kind of attachment object, a key attachment object for him in the narratives he tells. So here you see that providing energy services in a particular way can have more than just material significance. It's more about just material need, as Kate Soper puts it in this quotation. Even when it seems we're only gratifying the need for bread, we're always doing something more. The wood burner is a kind of symbol of a positive form of dependence that connects Terry's household to an informal energy system that's outside the networks of relationships that he sees binding his household and others to responsible actors. So I'm going to draw to a close now in summary, just giving you an overview of the themes I've been talking about. Those three themes which help read narratives of energy vulnerability through this lens from care ethics, which brings into the foreground the ways in which relationship and dependence are central, I think, to energy ethics in general, to thinking about how we should address energy-related issues. The qualitative research I've discussed concerns interviews that contain ways of reasoning contextually, ethical normative language about the significance of energy services that deal extensively with the experiences of dependence and their particular qualities. The different voice Carol Gilligan talked about can be seen as a distinct ethical viewpoint rooted in experiences that foreground interdependence, dependence, and vulnerability, a perspective that might be considered a subaltern perspective, which in her work tends to have a very strongly gendered aspect. In Terry's stories, returning to some of the themes that Gilligan introduced in her early work, it foregrounds some aspects of how people rely on energy services that are perhaps overlooked in debates about energy justice. Questions raised about how to frame energy justice debates in terms of rights, as I said at the beginning, have often focused on how we specify what kinds of energy services people might have a right to, also on how to identify who possesses obligations corresponding to these rights. And care ethics helps address that latter issue directly by reversing the question, and it adopts a viewpoint again like that of Robert Goodin, but a viewpoint expressed here by Simone Weil in 1952, that if you consider human needs, capabilities as obligations, you put the emphasis on identifying who has to fulfill those, whereas the question of the approach that focuses on rights can make claims which nobody specified to respond to. So the question of who responds is key in that view. Care acknowledges the existential vulnerability of human beings, but it also shows that specifying the vulnerabilities to which they're subject, you have to pay attention to the relationships of dependence in which people exist, relationships that change throughout the life course, and also it's shaped by socio-technical transformations. Further, some relationships of dependence make a positive contribution to well-being, others do not. So understanding the specificities of how power to harm is distributed around society, it's possible to determine what responsibilities need to be fulfilled and what treatment that genuinely supports people's interests, consumers' interests in the energy system might look like. So I suggested that the power to harm people through the inadvertent, perhaps, infliction of poverty, along with precarity and suffering in the specific senses I discussed previously, this is distributed among actors, some of whom are not directly involved in energy provision. Landlords are the key example mentioned previously, but there are others, given how housing and energy and the governance are interconnected. So the existence of non-voluntary obligations, which inhere in dependency relationships, gives a reason to hold accountable someone when harm has been done, even without reference to some antecedent right. So a care perspective gives you a grounding for this argument in its analysis of interdependence and vulnerability. The use of narrative, drawing on narrative, helps establish where harm is done, what form this takes over time, and where the power to cause or avert harm is located. Again, it's possible to do this without adverting to rights to energy. And it's Terry's interviews show examining attachments to people and to objects can help lay out how people faced with energy challenges are not just passive consumers of energy services caught up in dependency relationships that can often turn bad, but they're also caring subjects themselves who are sustained by networks of people and things that matter in particular ways. His household wood burner represents both his own agency in looking after himself and his partner, but also a network of supportive attachments. So the way of heating that he has in his house provides essential thermal comfort, but it also provides a sense of energy that undermines the feeling he reports continually of being a slave of the utility companies. It confirms to him that he and his partner are part of a community whose presence still retains some continuity with its past, a past characterized by solidarity and mutual aid. And it offers a glimpse of how things might be different, of how bad forms of dependence can be replaced by good forms. And I'll stop there and just thank you for your attention, and also to thank the rest of the members of the Understanding Risk Research Group, Flex's social science research team shown here. And I look forward to further discussion. Thank you very much.